Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Excellent.
Ready to go to work here and figure out what makes the world tick. But I want to start off with a news item that we did mention last week, and it's still in the news, and there's reason for bringing this up. And this has to do with the death of Colin Powell.
Yeah.
Because we remember him very well, because at the height of trying to stop the warmongering against Iraq and all the propaganda that was going on. And it wasn't just the final blow that Powell was engaged in by going to the UN and not telling the straight story.
Yeah.
He had to fib a little bit, and of course it worked, and the UN endorsed the war. But there was a lot of propaganda going on, because I remember before it was starting, months before, there was a lot of propaganda that sort of was against the war. But they had to change it, and the most important individual to change the attitude of the people who had high respect was Colin Powell. And he did his job well, but it wasn't long after that that whole thing fell apart, and it was a disastrous moment in Powell's life.
Yes.
And he never recovered from that. But that subject came up, of course, because he just passed away. And the other thing is, it combines, his history in the military, the great part that they recognize he was a great military hero. At the same time, he goofed when he had to testify before the United Nations. But then there's also the fact that he died with COVID. He was identified to have been infected with COVID, and yet he was fully vaccinated.
Yeah.
So at first we didn't hear too much about the full vaccination. Then it came out that he was fully vaccinated, and then the big question came up. That became then a political football in many ways. Well, see, the people who are against all these vaccines, see what it's doing? And then the other side had to come up and mock the people that would suggest this, saying you'll use anything to try to discourage people from practicing good medicine and telling the truth about vaccines. So that's really still ongoing, that argument. But Powell, of course, when he was doing this, there was something about it that wasn't, well, matter of fact, I probably didn't want convinced, but I wasn't convinced, and yet it satisfied the media, satisfied the politicians, satisfied the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
They were delighted because it meant a beginning of a long, tedious war, where some of the ramifications of that are still going on. I mean, you think there's peace and prosperity in Iraq? No. But this was to get things started in Iraq. I mean, it was a priority, making the big move into Afghanistan.
Well, they needed Colin Powell because he's the only one that had any credibility in the administration. The neocons were running roughshod. Nobody believed them anymore. Nobody believed Bush, who was, up to that point, up to 9/11 at least, considered a failed president and not fit for the job, really. So they brought out Powell because Powell did have that credibility. He was a Secretary of State. As you point out, he was considered a war hero. First African-American who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary of State, first time in history. So they brought him out, and we know from our old former friend, Colonel Wilkerson, what they did to him. They kept him up all night. They browbeat him. They forced him. That doesn't give him any excuses, though, because he knew what he was saying was untrue. But when when we watched it on your staff, we watched the presentation, and that was in early February of 2003. We knew what he was saying wasn't true because we were following things so closely, but we also knew that it was a devastating performance for our position because we knew how much credibility he had. It was hard enough for us to argue against the neocons, right, when they wanted the war, but you bring out Powell And for me, at least, I talked about it yesterday, it felt very deflating and demoralizing.
The big picture is that this was necessary to maintain and expand the empire, because this is to remake the Middle East. We heard those terms before, probably even before 9/11, but this is the excuse to remake the Middle East. But it also brings up the subject that we talk about because it's so effective in demonstrating what goes on, and that is that truth becomes a treasonous thing in an empire. And we certainly were on our way to an empire, and the Middle East supposedly was building our empire. But I would say that the final results aren't totally in, because it's not a very stable empire.
No.
If that's what we're going to depend on to maintain the empire of the world, it's getting a little bit shaky. But it certainly at that time was heralded as doing the thing that was necessary, and there were certain special interests that wanted us in there and wanted to have control. The people selling weapons wanted to have control. The oil people wanted all this. So it went on and on. But things are a lot different now, and at least the story is coming out that Powell was disingenuous when he was going to the United Nations, and yet he wasn't an easy target. I mean, he had what 30 or 40 years where he was held in high esteem, but it also gives us an indication that when you stick to the truth and you define everything to the best of your ability by finding out what is true and what is not, eventually truth does win out in the end. And I think it is late. It took a long time, but now the history is much clearer. Back then, but so much of our foreign policy is based on the shenanigans that were going on back then. That is, of course, the reason why, even though I was young when we went into Korea, I remember enough hearing adults speak about Korea, that we were going in under the United Nations, and I remember, thinking about declaration of war. Oh, and then Truman, we're not declaring war. This is a police action. You talk about lying in the war. I mean, each one of our wars, if you want to sort it out, you don't always find the truth, and sometimes it takes a lot of history to find out the truth. But in this case, at least we know there was a lot of distortion there. A lot of people have suffered, and the best we can do, a lot of times the question came up during the campaign and the presidential campaign, is that we would get involved and it would be a mess, but we had to continue it because we didn't want the people who had been there to die and have died in vain. So, so far right now, it's going to be pretty hard to stir up trouble and say, well, matter of fact, the criticism is still now, like in Vietnam, there are still people who say, the hawks are still saying, well, we left too soon. We should have worked harder on it. 20 years wasn't enough, and it continues. But anyway, there should be a powerful lesson here, and then in combining it with some of the things we'll mention also about the COVID episode, because there's a lot of distortion and fibbing there. There's false truths, and sorting out the truth there is not an easy task.
Yeah, well, the reason they kept doing it is that he got away with it. And the thing is, you might be able, if you can even understand how he was browbeaten into doing this and he was abused, whatever you want to say, he was a big boy. But after the fact, he made no effort. He made no effort to try to get to the bottom of it. He never spoke out and said, these creeps lied to me, they set me up. He never did that, and he could have, and he would have cleared his name. But we also know, and this is an article from The Intercept back in 2018, we also know, and this is really damning, we know that he knew he was lying at the time, because the memos from the State Department's Department of Intelligence and Research, where I worked briefly, they sent out memos before the event that he surely must have seen because he was Secretary of State, and they almost every bullet point of the presentation, they flagged it as weak. And here we know this from the declassified INR memos. Powell said, quote, "We know Saddam's son Qusay ordered the removal of all prohibited weapons from Saddam's numerous palace complex." The INR memo itself said, second bullet point, weak. Quisay ordered to remove prohibited items. He said, Powell said, key files from military and scientific establishments have been placed in cars that are being driven around the countryside by Iraqi intelligence agents. The INR said before the presentation, that's weak. That's weak. Plausibility open to question. On and on and on, and you can read this, and I'll have to remember to link this article. It's a very good article from The Intercept. On and on. Last bullet, weak. The one with the missiles with biological warheads going around, weak, weak. Can't be proven. So he knew when he went in there that he was lying, and that's to his great disgrace.
And, and the information was immediately available for the people who were paying attention. So there was a strong opposition to it, but there was a very, it was weak in the sense of reaching the people in this country who make a difference that objected to it, because that organization, which is the military-industrial complex and the media, pumping up the warmongering and pumping up, the patriotism and all.
Yeah.
That's always very, very strong. And the ability, even though the truth was there, the ability to get that out and get the general public believing it and understanding it and saying, no way do we want to send our kids over there. So it is something that is perpetual. This is human nature, how they do it, and everybody has their excuse for going to war, and what a pity. And it's probably one of the reasons why we have a little organization here called the Institute for Peace and Prosperity, because we actually believe it's achievable if you do the right things.
They go hand in hand. Well, you touched a little bit on the COVID aspect
Right.
of the general's death, and of course, I don't think it's very necessarily valid to say that the vaccination and the COVID are necessarily hand in hand in this case, because he was a very ill person, as you pointed out.
Yeah, this isn't the time to have the final solution, on the vaccines. There's a lot of emotions involved because he was very sick. He had multiple myeloma and he had Parkinson's disease, and a really bad cold or say a strep throat would have been very, very life-threatening to him. And so that's one thing. So to use this as the final argument, we have enough arguments about the efficacy of the vaccines. But still, I think the whole mess that we have with COVID is still based on a big lie, just like what the war was based on, a big lie. The war against COVID, the big lie is really the one to narrow it down to get people to understand that, which is so strange. It's this anti-science. Yeah. If you're not anti-science, then well, they call it pro-science on their terms. But what they said, the one thing that they use is whether or not you believe in natural immunity. Yeah. Now, natural immunity has been around for a few years, and they've used it a long time before they had a full understanding of the details of the the biochemistry and immunities and all this. But so they knew about natural immunities, and yet now you're in trouble. You can lose your job over that. Yeah. And lose a livelihood, and your family can suffer. You can be a famous football player, and you might not ever get to play again, all because of this thing. And of course, they would say that we're the ones that are promoting the lie. What we want to do is promote an honest discussion about this, the honest discussion that eventually, crept out and people understand about the lie of going into Iraq. Yeah. And when is there going to be a more objective debate go on about lying us into the COVID war? Yeah. Without ignoring the seriousness of it. Yes, if the elderly are more vulnerable, and if you have cancer and multiple myeloma, boy, you better watch out and you better do whatever you can, and there are certain drugs that are available, and if people can convince you about the vaccines, they at least should be on the table. Yeah. Right now, though, it's just beginning to allow people to talk about chloro and chloroquine, and also ivermectin. Yeah. Now we're just beginning to talk about it, but you can still lose your job or if you speak too loudly.
And in fact, that'll be our next story. But I just wanted to do one final thing on this because, as I mentioned yesterday, they always will talk about the comorbidities when someone also had the vaccine, but you can never talk about it if they're COVID deaths. But here's an egregious example of this, the goofiness. And if you can put this up, if this was just some joker, I wouldn't even put it up. But this is supposedly a serious person. If you can put that first picture up, this is Kevin Barron. He's the editor of Defense One. That's a major publication covering the military and the defense community. And let's look at his next tweet. This tells you, it's just goofy. He said, "Darn it, they killed Colin Powell. Their sick devotion to partisan political power and personality cults over public health and security, knowledge and intelligence has killed 700,000 of us. R.I.P., Mr. Secretary. Get vaccinated. Mask up. Stop the spread." Well, it's kind of funny because, as we know, Colin Powell was vaccinated. So using his death as a fully vaccinated person as an excuse to get vaccinated is hardly convincing.
Do you think he had a serious
No,
target?
he was mad. He was mad at the rest of us who were not in favor of compulsory vaccines.
Isn't it something where do these things cross when truth becomes so absurd that nobody believes them anyway? They pretend it's true.
Yeah.
So.
Well, let's put up the next one. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say we wanted to talk about the drugs.
Yeah, let's put up that next picture just to kick it off. This is from the Epoch Times out of Nebraska, and this is the Nebraska Attorney General, and he has now said that doctors can prescribe ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine off-label for COVID-19. It's a little bit late, but it's interesting news nevertheless.
Yeah, well, once again, truth has been floating around here for a long time. They've had to, make a big effort to cancel out the people who happen to know a lot more about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, where people in certain parts of the world had practical reasons to do it. And then when you get into the economics of it all, how much did it cost for a package of some of these medications to be sent out to millions of people in India?
Yeah.
And yet the world ignored the benefits that came from it. They're terrified of competition.
Yeah.
Ideological competition or just competition over thinking and dealing with science or whatever. All of a sudden it's turned into racial conflicts and all these things that if you don't go along, you belong to some racial theory and therefore you have to be rejected, and that to me is a mess. But there's so much now. This is good that they're doing this. Maybe the statistics will change over there. But I also know that they're in places. I know of people who made calls for their insurance company, and it was perfectly legal where they were calling. And they say, no, the drugstore said, the insurance companies won't pay for it. So it's what they want you to do is go through the insurance company, and for a $5 pill that you could have and be safer and probably more effective, they want you to pay $600.
Yeah, of course.
And all of a sudden it ended up in the coffers of some pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, well, that is a good point because people should go and have a look at how many lobbyists Big Pharma has on Capitol Hill. That's number one. And number two, look at the revolving door between FDA, CDC top executives, and high-paid Big Pharma positions. People like Gottlieb and others, they make a fortune. But in Nebraska, just to finish it up, he was not endorsing the prescription. All the Attorney General says is you cannot punish. He said that the available data does not justify filing disciplinary actions against physicians simply because they prescribe ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine to prevent or treat COVID-19. So, yeah, it's kind of a baby step. You don't have to go to jail if you do this, but as you say, it should have been doctor and patient all along.
Just a little bit of liberty released, and when it becomes more knowledgeable, it will explode. And I think we've seen some of that already, that the resistance to the masking and other things. I think this is going to happen, especially now that the natural curves and the natural immunity is working in, and they'll say, well, why are we doing this? And but they'll figure out some fib to tell because truth is a treason in an empire. You
Yeah.
know, and our job is to have the empire, and truly there are some people who you want to give them a pass and say, well, they're just confused, and this is why they do this. This is why they close down our cities and fire the police when there's more violence, and why you get rid of the health workers when our hospitals are overflowing. They want to make excuses, but eventually, common sense. That's just hope that it hasn't been killed, and I don't think it has been, because I think when you do what is difficult is getting people willing to step forward and put so much on the line, for their families, and figuring, if I don't have this job, I have to do it. I don't believe this stuff. That is the mess. But as long as we see items like this, I think that's what happened, with the attendance at the athletic events.
Yeah.
Do you think these people are going there? They never look worried to me about sitting beside somebody, and they sat pretty close.
Yeah, they're also having a lot of
yelling and screaming at each other.
They're yelling a lot of chants there these days.
Yeah.
That, we can't really repeat on the show, but it's. But speaking of tyranny, I mean, I know there's probably a lot of competition, but I think that this is probably the most incompetent mayor in the entire country. This is a monster, and she's also incredibly dumb. And here she is, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. She says, and we talked about this in a previous show, Dr. Paul, recently, how the head of the police union had been advising his officers, don't go online and report your status like Lightfoot wants. It's none of her business what your vaccine status is. Now, she got a court order to tell him to shut up and forced him to shut up, but then she went again overboard. She's not busy trying to catch the people that are shooting people in Chicago. She's busy attacking the police. And let's look at that first video, if we can. Actually, go back to that link and play that video. This is her yesterday at a press conference attacking the police union. Make sure we get sound. There we go.
And we're not having that. The contract is clear and it's been known for a long time. The police unions are not authorized to strike. It's in their collective bargaining agreement. It's a matter of state law. What we've seen from the Fraternal Order of Police, and particularly the leadership, is a lot of misinformation, a lot of half-truths, and frankly flat-out lies in order to induce an insurrection. And we're not having that.
The police are trying to induce an insurrection.
Yeah.
I wonder if she just learned that word.
Probably.
What a bad
Want to
person.
go on?
Let's go on.
On our friend and colleague, Adam Dick.
Yeah.
Because he makes a point, which is an important point, and he better be right.
Yeah.
He's saying that there's evidence to show that people are now in a mood, even though he admitted that there are moods swings, with people, probably depending on how things are going with their personal finances or something. But he was saying that there's a move right now for people wanting less government. They're not saying, well, things are bad now. What we need is more government. We need an insurrection by the police in Chicago, and everything is going to be okay.
Yeah, and he was citing a new Gallup poll, and Gallup does this poll every year, and they ask Americans, do you think the government is trying to do too many things, or do you think it should do more to solve problems? And this is the poll that he's citing. Let's put it up because the results are encouraging. We need a little bit of good news. Let's look at that next clip. There's a big change from last year to this year, back in 2020, and that probably is understandable when you consider the COVID situation and how terrified people were, thanks mostly to the mainstream media and lying politicians. That was 54% wanted the government to do more last year, as opposed to 41% who thought it was doing too much. Well, that has flip-flopped, Dr. Paul, and now, great news, 52% of all Americans think the government is trying to do too much, and 43 only, which is a clear minority, believe the government should do more. So we're going back in the right direction, like you always say.
Yeah, at least it made the turn a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think we're dealing with a battle that's been going on for a lot of history.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that things can't be improved, because I would say when you look at history in the terms of 3,000 years, there's been a better understanding. I would say that, events like the Declaration of Independence and our revolution, that there was an emphasis on personal liberty, imperfectly, but there was still movement in that direction. And of course, there were certain things in history in these thousands of years that moved it. When I get discouraged is when they discovered 3,000 years ago a certain basic principle, and our government right now rejects it.
Yeah.
Like innocent until proven guilty. And we ignore that, and that's what our government does so often right now.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to close with just a little bit of hypocrisy, and I know this will shock you, Dr. Paul, but the hypocrisy goes all the way to the top. And let's play that second video clip. We have a link to. This is our own dear Commander-in-Chief, President Biden, walking through a very ritzy restaurant in Georgetown. You'll notice something unusual about him as he walks by. There's his wife, there's the president. All the lowly Americans who serve him had masks on, but the president, despite the fact that there was a mask mandate, there is a mask mandate in D.C., you must wear your mask. The president, maybe in his defense, he probably forgot, but he didn't have a mask on. Of course, everyone who served him did. And let's look at these couple of clips about it, because his spokesperson, Jen Psaki, who was really a creep, she was asked about it. And there's a picture of her, and here he is walking through without his mask. He's got it in his hand, so he's probably protected from COVID. But let's look at the next one. She was asked by Ducey from Fox, what's going on with that? He said, how come he wasn't wearing his mask? She said, there are moments when we all don't put masks back on as quickly as we should. Then she said, it's important, quote, not overly focus on moments in time that don't reflect overarching policy.
We need them on television a lot, and they are on a lot, and maybe that's why the polls are going down for Biden. He's being exposed.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that people didn't realize, and I didn't at the beginning, is when we see a major announcement being made at the White House, they're not even in the White House.
Yeah, it's all fake. Isn't that
fake.
Weird?
It's a fake.
Yeah.
So, but I mentioned this the other day that Biden was on his high horse, and he was describing the various problems. He says, there's only one problem: leadership. We need leadership, whether it's COVID and whether it's this or oil prices or inflation. Leadership. And it was sort of like a joke, I thought, but no, he was serious. But now that I was thinking, well, maybe he's our leader now. Get rid of your mask. In spite of these clowns around you, they're still wearing them. Get rid of them. We need leadership like that.
Yeah,
you talk about confused definitions and what is true. What are we supposed to do? But I make fun of that, but I understand that is a real problem for especially children, trying to figure out, why are we doing this and what does it mean, and I don't like it, and they're told one thing and hear another, then they hear the television and the whole nonsense. So it is, but a lot of adults go through this, and also the statistics on psychological problems right now and even suicide are terrible, and it's because the leaders they don't have a basic principle that they're following. They don't. Matter of fact, half of these people who run our country or more, they don't even believe in the principle that there is something known as truth, that you seek truth. We know that truth is out there. We know that there's no one person or group that has a perfect knowledge of the truth, but it's also been known throughout all of history that has been one of the most important distinguishing factors, is that you seek truth. You seek truth, and you try to understand it enough and if it's beneficial, then spread that message. That's been around a long time. But now we are dealing with people, they don't even believe that you can find truth on there. They're nihilists. They believe there's zero out there and you can't find a truthful answer to anything. And that's why it's no big deal. Natural immunity. Yeah, that used to be true, but it's not true anymore. So that's what we believe in. But they don't use the word nihilist. We should use it more often.
Yes, absolutely. I'm all done, Dr.
Yeah,
Paul.
very good. I want to thank our viewers today for tuning in, and I think that we should finish by saying that we do remain optimistic, and when we see these terribly dumb things going on, we should use them to show, a lot of people wake up quietly at first, but they eventually want to go to the football game and have a good time. So what we want to do is make sure our society is willing to meet and play together and work together and treat other people the way they're supposed to. And I think then we will be marching on to a situation where we will gain our peace and our prosperity. Thank you very much for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.